Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulina Muhammad al-Amin, wa na'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome back to another session discussing the traditional religious narrative within Islam around religion and the state, as understood by the classical jurists. And what I'm putting forth in this discussion is a discussion around the perspective of one scholar, Javed Ahmed Ghamidi, who had an extensive discussion on this topic some years ago in 2015 in a series of videos that he produced that are known as the Dallas Lectures. And those videos came on the heels of a broader discussion that he had been engaged in within Pakistan on this question, both of the narrative and what he called his counter narrative, or his offering with regard to a different perspective on how we should understand this relationship between religion and state within Islam. The discussion around this, which we haven't gotten into too much, but really consisted included, article that he published in one of the major papers in Pakistan, and then also published through his institute, and numerous responses to that, particularly from the traditional ulama. And it was a robust discussion that took place and really worth sort of examining in detail. And part of the goal of these sessions that I'm conducting is to give the opportunity for those who are unable to access the primary language in which those took place, which was in the language of Urdu, to engage with this topic and this discussion and have an avenue in to some of Javed Ghamidi's ideas in this context. So, picking up where we left off, we'd been talking about Ghamdi's notion that within the traditional religious narrative, there are 5 key points. And again, this is the traditional religious narrative around the relationship between religion and the state, and specifically Islam and the state, right? And so within that, he says there are 5 main points. There are 5 main points that are part of the traditional narrative. And we've gone through the first 3 of them, right? We discussed the first main point, which he says is this idea that they're in agreement that shirk, kufr, irtidad, apostasy, all of these things, the associating partners with God, the denial of truth, the sort of leaving of the Muslim faith, all of these things are things that should be eliminated or should not be an occurrence, right? That is part of the objective that should be pursued. That all are agreement within the traditional narrative that this is something that needs to happen. The second point is as it relates to the concept of jihad and some of the components of that, but most importantly, the idea that the objective of jihad is to eliminate kufr, to eradicate, to get rid of disbelief. That within the traditional narrative, within the classical legal literature of the fuqaha, that is really, when they speak of jihad, that's what they are really talking about, is that very specific warfare against kufr, against disbelief. And then the third point that we looked into was this idea of the establishment of a caliphate. And part of that connected to the notion that the traditional jurists, the classical jurists, would divide the world up into 2 parts, Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb, land of Islam, land of warfare, right? But and so that's how they conceptualized it in the past, and as it moved into the modern period, this same mindset had a deep attachment to the idea of caliphate, the idea of this unified Muslim governing entity that had religious significance, that it wasn't simply something that administered a state, but that it carried this other quality, this symbolism, this notion of sacredness, even if you will, and that in the modern period, then the goal became to restore that to some degree, right? So that's the third point. These are the 3 points we have, and we have 2 more that Ghamidi Sahab discusses within his explanation of the traditional narrative. The 4th point that he takes up, he says that within this, and we had talked about within the caliphate the idea of, well, what's the status of non-Muslims within Dar al-Islam? And we'd noted that for Dar al-Islam, the classical narrative, the traditional narrative, they can't conceive within their reality of anything but a subjugated status for those who are not Muslim, right? Within their sort of conceptualization of the world, which we've noted, eradication of kufr, et cetera, like there isn't this notion that they're going to be equal citizens, right? That's really not how the pre-modern world functioned anyway, right? That is really a modern notion that comes about. And so for them, these non-Muslims will have certain rights, etc., like treated with respect, all of that, but it's second-class status. And part of what I raised was, and which is going to come through in the counter-narrative, is the complications of that mindset, that narrative, having that notion of subjugated status for non-Muslims. What happens when that gets transferred into the modern period and applied to a republic, right? A republic that has, in its concept, a basic notion of equal citizenship, but now it's an Islamic republic. So what does that mean? And we're going to get into that in a few sessions. Something to look forward to. All right. So the 4th point within the traditional narrative that Ghamidi Sahab brings up is what he says is the relationship with Muslims within Dar al-Islam, right? So we've talked about, as I just noted, if, non-Muslims within Dar al-Islam, they're in a subjugated status. If they aren't in Dar al-Islam, if they're external to Dar al-Islam, then there's a notion that they need to be subjugated. We talked about the idea of they exist in Dar al-Harb, like that there is a constant, in some respects, war footing there. And in the medieval period, the notion of conquering, etc., is very normal. Like everybody sort of has that. And so Islam is kind of picking up within that the fuqaha and the idea of kind of that type of engagement, right? So the relationship for that traditional mindset, the historic classical mindset, religious mindset, is one of kind of being at war to some degree. And this idea of kind of the modern notions of like we are all human beings bonded together, we're fellow citizens, etc., this is really alien to that religious mindset that is premised upon this traditional narrative. There it is Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Kufr. That juxtaposition doesn't really create space for some of these other modern notions of sort of universal human brotherhood and things like that. Now, as a side note, that's not to say that scholars in the modern period have not attempted to or do not continue to attempt to try to find space within that traditional narrative to reimagine or rethink these type of relationships. Certainly that's the case. And some, one could argue, are somewhat successful, some are not. And I'm not offering Ghamidi Saab's opinion there, that's just my own analysis as an academic, that this does take place, and one can evaluate those on their own terms as to whether they are successful in any way or not. And many very prominent ulama around the world who arguably come from within this traditional narrative are doing some of that reconceptualizing, if you will, right? And it's for each individual to determine whether it's being done successfully or with any consistency in relation to the traditional narrative. Now, The other idea that we talked about was a nation state, and the classical religious mindset can't really accept that nation state concept. If we're looking at it in its, in its true form, right? The idea of kind of rights for non-Muslims, there's certainly certain rights that they acknowledged, but the notion of equal rights didn't quite make sense to them in that period. Dominance had to be achieved, right? Dominance had to be achieved, and historically, dominance was present for this traditional narrative, because Muslims were in power, right? In the modern period, if you transfer that narrative to the modern period, dominance by force is one option, but given the weak state of Muslims in that post-colonial period, and even when they formed these nation states, and given the fact that they are now part of this international community that comes with it certain responsibilities, etc., many of those folks that are wedded to the traditional narrative began to conceive of other ways in which domination could occur that didn't necessarily involve force. And one of those ways was the force that comes from being in the majority, right? And so for a lot of these folks that are wedded to the idea of the caliphate, they may not express it, but it's there, the notion that at some point we would like to achieve this sort of unified Muslim political entity. Ghamidi Sahib says that for them, the nation state is just step one towards that goal. And within that step one, having a majority within that nation state is a type of domination, right? It's a type of domination that allows sort of kufr or the folks who are not Muslim to be in a subjugated status, right? Not precisely the way that it was in the medieval context, but for all intents and purposes, the same in sort of this majoritarian context. Okay. Now, one thing to bear in mind, though, is that when we're thinking about this fourth point, right, the relationship with Muslims in Dar al-Islam, we have to take a step back and think about, for the traditional narrative in the modern context, how do they think about the state? A political scientist, or particularly maybe one who does Western political theory, Ghamidi Sahib notes that if you come at it from a political science perspective, then the rationale for the construction of a government or of a state, of some organizing entity that is going to administer over people in a particular polity, from a political science perspective, it's this idea of a social contract, right? That is sort of a notion that those who study political theory know about, right? Ghamidi Sahib explains it as such. He says it's the idea that there's a human being has free will. That free will could potentially be misused, and in that misuse, it could be that they misuse it for transgressions against other people's lives, human life, against other property, people's property, right? And there is a need for this to be resolved, right? There's a need for this to be resolved in order to protect sort of justice and peace within that polity. That is the political science view with regard to the nation state. But Ghamidi Sahib says that the fiqh, or classical fuqaha, the classical legal, Islamic legal sort of approach to it is quite different, right? Government and the purpose of government is for the establishment of religion. It's not really for peace and order, which are also worthwhile things, right? He's not dismissive of it. Ghamidi Sahib recognizes that even within the classical narrative, these are worthwhile things, and even one might say religious duties in some respects, but the objective of government is not justice, peace, etc. It's the establishment of religion. In the traditional narrative, that is the objective, right? That you establish religion, and you first establish in your nation state, and then you look to establish it elsewhere, because remember again from our previous sessions, as Ghamidi Saab noted, the traditional narrative, the overarching objective is the eradication of kufr, of shirk, of the dominion of Islam everywhere. Islam as the universal state in some respects. The modern scholars who are still coming out of the traditional narrative have simply said, hey, we're going to just start with the nation state. And then we'll build from there. We're going to start in our particular context and build from there. Right? So Ghamidi Saab points out that there's still, the long game is still the same. They've just made in some respects a type of compromise to say, hey, we're going to start here as step one to the eventual caliphate. Right? Now, the idea then being, all right, we're going to establish religion. This then has consequences for the Muslims, or the people who say that they're Muslim, or who claim that identity, who are then living under Muslim government. Because what it means is, if the objective of even having a government in the first place is the establishment of religion, then it is assumed that Muslims under that government are going to live following Islam. And if they're going to live under that government and they decide that they don't want to follow Islam or certain religious practices, then the government has a right to enforce that on them, to enforce religion upon them. Right? And the idea within the traditional narrative is that the government has the right to enforce that in every aspect of religion, in all public spaces. Right? In all public spaces. And there Ghamidi Saab points out that there is a distinction, right? Private space and what goes on there is more protected. There is no real right of the government to intrude into those spaces. The traditional narrative is really speaking towards the public space. So that responsibility, that right is given to the government to enforce religion within public space. As a result, you see, Ghamidi Saab says, that whenever a religious government comes into existence, and he points to really three of them in the Muslim world in the last century or last century or so, right? Say Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Afghanistan under the Taliban. In both, I guess, in the first iteration and then the second that's more recently come, right? That these three religious governments that came into place, each of them went about enforcing and establishing religion and religious practice in their spaces in extensive, pervasive ways, right? Such that if you're making a mistake during your wudu somewhere in public, that some religious police officer can enforce or cause or insist that you do it right. In the same way, the sort of, as Ghamidi Saab points out, the ideas around veiling or wearing a niqab or burqa, right? That those requirements in sort of Afghanistan, right, became part of the establishment of religion in that space. And all of that, he says, connects to this idea that one of the responsibilities is commanding the right and forbidding the wrong, forbidding the munkar right? Nahyan al-munkar, right? That you're going to forbid that wrong. So that is part of what is going on in the establishment of religion. You cannot, he says, violate the law under a religious state without that state coming after you to correct you, and then they also have the right to punish you for your transgressions as it relates to religion. Right? So what is the role of the Islamic government? It's to subjugate, in the traditional narrative here, they're going to subjugate non-Muslims in their space and enforce religion on Muslims, right? Enforce religion on Muslims, because that is part of the overall objective, right? The fear, of course, is that if you don't do that, if you don't enforce religion on Muslims, if you give them the freedom to not engage in religious practice, then it doesn't just have an impact on them in their individual capacity, because again, we're not speaking about things that are happening in private, we're speaking about things in public. So for instance, if you allow somebody, let's say, the argument would be, if you allow them to eat in public during Ramadan, during the fasting hours, then essentially it's not just simply you giving that individual the freedom to do that. What you are potentially doing is opening the floodgates for others to engage in the same type of transgressions, right? The rationale is that if you open the door for one, it's going to be bust open for everybody else to come through, right? It's going to be made wide open for others to come through. And this will create disorder and chaos, and potentially a culture of just violating religious law. In private, state has no jurisdiction over you. Okay. So we've dealt with the fourth point now, dealing how it is that the traditional narrative imagines the state dealing with Muslims in the context of religion. And we've talked about the fact that they are going to be involved in implementing religious law, that the state will be involved in the enforcement of religion, which means essentially implementing religious law in the land. The fifth point and final point of the traditional narrative expands on this. Ghamidi Sahib says that it's not simply the implementation of religious law, but what the traditional narrative says is the state also has a role in making sure that the creed, the aqidah, the beliefs of those Muslims are also correct. If you will, the state has a role in pushing back against any type of heterodoxy, of any type of deviation as it relates to belief, of deviant beliefs. So not just enforcing in the space of practice, religious practice, but also sort of enforcing in the space of religious belief, which of course is a more complicated proposition, right? Religious practice, you're able to see, is this person coming for Salat al-Jum'ah? Are they coming to pray on Fridays in congregation? Or are they fasting in Ramadan, or, which basically by default you assume they are unless you see them eating or drinking or something, right? That practice is a little easier in some respects, but the traditional narrative has some responsibility on the state as it relates to belief as well. And historically, we've seen some of this emerge, right? Historically, we've seen this come about. Okay, and we'll get to that in a second. But the state is responsible not only for making sure the rulings of Islam are instituted among the Muslim population, but Ghamidi Sahib says that they are also involved, according to the traditional narrative, in making sure Muslims are following the correct beliefs within Islam. And what this does is then empower the state within the traditional narrative, according to Ghamidi Sahib. It empowers the state within the traditional narrative to declare some individual or some group as non-Muslim, right? That their belief gets so deviant that that declaration can potentially be made. And partly this role of correcting belief is a responsibility for the state in the same way that they have a responsibility to ferret out crime and sort of that type of misbehavior. It's a type of misbehavior that the state needs to put in check. Heresies and other types of deviant sort of beliefs that then have the potential to spread and impact others. The state, right, the governing entity has a role to play as a corrective there. Making determinations with regard to correct belief ends up being something that falls on the state, right? Again, what they believe within their own private quarters, the state's actually not that concerned about classically, traditionally not that concerned. In fact, one might argue that the modern state and its peculiar or unique features and coercive features has given the sort of modern nation state an ability to intrude on those beliefs that are happening even within closed doors, sort of in private, a little bit more, much more than the classical state as imagined or as existed in the medieval period. But that's a discussion for another place. Essentially, these wrong behaviors, these munkars, right? Nahiyan al-munkar, right? This is partly falling within that category. The state is obligated to take action against it, even by force. You give counsel, you punish. If the aqidah does not reform, then you can even take steps as the state to declare them non-Muslim. The most prominent, or one of the more prominent examples of this, we've already had some discussion of, is the Ahmadiyya, right? The religious sort of mindset premised on the traditional narrative requires something be done about them, right? In their context, in Pakistan, they sort of first are made legally non-Muslim, despite their own claims of being Muslim. That the state takes that up initially as their way of correcting deviant belief, and then moves from there to other things. They're required, the Ahmadiyya, not to represent themselves as Muslim in any way. Ghamidi Sahib notes that they were forced to remove the Shahadatain from the Shahada and other sort of symbols, minarets or symbols that would signify this as a regular Muslim masjid or mosque. They were, or any type of institution that had Muslims do, they were forced to remove that by the state for fear that in some respects, one, they couldn't represent themselves like that, but then that their deviant belief might spread to others. The state took that upon themselves, right? So that, and to the point actually he notes that even them reading the Quran, right, was out loud publicly, was sort of seen as them representing themselves as Muslim, and criminal action could be brought against them for that. Right? Their burial rites, a series of things that sort of were done ostensibly as a way to correct deviance with regard to aqidah and belief. Right? Now, the consequence of this is that the traditional narrative views this as a responsibility of the state. But in those circumstances where the state does not take that responsibility on in the modern period, what we have begun to see, Ghamidi Saab points out, is that then individuals start taking things into their own hands. They start feeling as though they have a green light to take on the role of the state. They start functioning, in some respects, as mini caliphates, instituting punishment, instituting judgment in their individual capacity. They look at it as a religious duty of the state, but if the state is not fulfilling it, then they take it on themselves. That they then become the ones who are going to correct belief. And as a consequence, you end up seeing in the Muslim world a type of vigilantism that is premised on the idea that if the state is not going to carry out this responsibility that God has placed on it, then we as groups or individuals are going to take up that mantle. And there are many things to be said there with regard to what that means for the social and political order of any nation state. But for our purposes here, it's just indicative of the extent to which the traditional narrative has an expectation that the state will not simply be involved in the corrective or in correcting Muslim practice and Muslim actions, but also Muslim belief. And we'll pick this up next time as we continue our discussion of the traditional narrative. وقولي قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم وسائر المسلمين والحمد لله رب العالمين.